Welcome everyone to our event, Why the Mascot Matters, sponsored by the South Shore Unity Council and hosted by Whitman Hanson's No Place for Hate Club. We are so thankful to the South Shore Unity Council for sponsoring us. And we are joined today by Fairies Gray, who is the Sagamore of the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapog. And we're so grateful that he's taken the time to talk to us about this important issue. And we're very excited to hear what you have to say.
Hello, everyone. My name is Farius Gray. I am the Sagamore of the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. Sagamore is the translation for Sagamore is war chief. I'm one of the three traditional leaders of my tribe. The leadership roles are the Sachem, which many people mispronounce Sanchem, but it's pronounced Sachem. And that's the main chief. And then you would have the powwow or the powwosk. And those are the medicine man or the medicine woman. And then you would have the Sagamore, which would be the war chief. And how our structure works is that these three traditional leaders would lead. And sometimes the titles are interchangeable. If the leader is both the lead, Sachem, and also the war chief, sometimes they would just call that Sachem Sagamore. And so it depends with the local tribes and what their needs were and who their leaders were. Sometimes the medicine person would be the lead Sachem. And so that all would change. And our leadership was handed down through the generations. When the English first came here, they would call us royal or royalty. It's kind of inaccurate. Traditionally, the leadership was passed down to your children. But if your children were not leaders, then that title and that responsibility would not be passed down to them. And so it was always changing. But traditionally, when you were born and one of your parents were the leaders, that's how you were raised. You were raised to be a leader. And so you would fit that responsibility. So that's who I am. And thank everybody for coming here tonight, this evening. Really appreciate it to learn a little bit about the Massachusetts tribe and about mascots. And the title here is Why Mascots Matter. So in order for me to explain why Mascot Matters is tell you a little bit of our history, Massachusetts history, and why the Commonwealth is named after us, so you can better understand our perspective of Indigenous mascots. So I'll take you way, way, way back, more than 400 years ago. The French were the first to come here, not the first, were the first colonists to come here. And they sailed from up north because they followed on the northern Atlantic. They didn't come straight across. A lot of people think they came straight across the Atlantic. That's not how they traveled. They kind of hugged the coastline of all the islands that are in the northern Atlantic, Iceland and Greenland and such, Nova Scotia. Sorry, I'm tongue-tied. And so the French came from the north, and they came here not to settle at first. The French came here to trade. They were interested in furs. They were interested in those pelts. That's what they were interested in. They were not interested in settling. And so they would have trading posts. But early on, they didn't have any colonies. They had no interest in it. They just wanted to trade. And so they traded mainly with the northern tribes, northern New England and Canada. Those tribes were primarily hunters and trappers. When they got to the Massachusetts, they seen that there was a different lifestyle here with our people. We were not primarily hunters or trappers, even though that's what we would do when need be. We're primarily farmers. That's what we did. We grew food, and we were fishermen, fisherwomen, however you prefer. That's what we did. And so the French would not trade with us because as they wrote, we spent too much of our time hunting and fishing. I mean, farming and growing and fishing to dedicate time to trapping and hunting. So they had no desire to trade with us because we had nothing they really wanted. So they traded with the northern tribes and not with the Massachusetts. And the only problem with that was, and we're talking late 1500s, early 1600s. And the only problem with that is that the Massachusetts were at war with the Abenaki, located in Maine, in southeastern Canada. So we're at war with the Abenaki, and the Abenaki were actively trading with the French. And so this shifted the balance of power because the Abenaki had access to French technology, European technology. And so the power balance shifted when the colonists first started coming here. And by the time the English came here, the Abenaki, who were losing a war with the Massachusetts, were now winning a war with the Massachusetts. And so now we're talking, the real early 1600s, when the English fishermen would come here and they would document things. They sail by. Not too many of the colonists or Europeans at this time would come ashore. The Massachusetts weren't exactly friendly with the Europeans, cordial, but not exactly friendly. And they were warned not to travel into what is now Boston Harbor. So they did not. They would just sail on by. The English would periodically, the French would periodically come ashore and try to trade some things with us, just what they needed, nothing for profit. The English were more interested in us, the Massachusetts. They were more interested in our numbers, which they documented, more interested in our leaders, which they documented. And at the time, it might seem innocent, but considering what happened after, it was not. So the English would write that the Massachusetts had a population of 3,000, which is not accurate. They were only counting the warriors or the men. They weren't counting the women or the children, which says a lot about what their intentions were. And so right around 1615, plagues hit the Massachusetts. Totally decimated the tribe. 90% of our population were killed. Whole villages were dead. Whole bands, whole families were dead. It was written that there were so many dead, there was no one left to bury the dead. So if you can just picture that, and if you can picture all these dead people on the lands which we are on today, thousands and thousands of dead people. And now maybe we can relate a little bit better than in the past because of COVID. How afraid was everybody when COVID first hit us? How uncertain was the future? How uncertain was what's going to happen to us and our families? We isolated. Everyone withdrew from society. Everyone was fearful. I know I was fearful for myself and my family. And now just imagine if COVID killed 90% of our population here. How afraid would you be? That's what my ancestors had to experience. And after the plagues, if you can imagine, that's when the English decided to colonize. And it's been said that the plagues, as we call it, happened because there were two cultures interacting for the first time. And one culture had no immunities to the diseases that the other culture had some immunity to. Which is fine if we hadn't been trading with the English and the French for nearly 100 years before they colonized here. And you would think that if some kind of disease was going to be transmitted, it would be transmitted in that time when they're coming ashore and we're interacting, but it was not. Just by chance, the plagues hit the Massachusetts right before they colonized. 1615 to 1619. 1620, look, Pilgrims' land. And the Pilgrims were thinking that this land was prepared for them by their God. It's cleared for them by their God. It was not. It was cleared by the plagues. So the Massachusetts were extremely wary of any European because the Europeans came, plagues followed, then the Europeans settled. And the Europeans, the English were already here. Even before 1620, they're already here. They just didn't have a permanent settlement. They had temporary fishing villages, fishing settlements here, which they were permitted to have because it was temporary. It wasn't until the Pilgrims came that it was more permanent. They came to live, to stay. And the Pilgrims wrote when they first came that when they landed, they found all the country in the sole possession of Chickatabat. Now, no one knows who Chickatabat was. Chickatabat was the Sachem, or the main chief of the Massachusetts, south of the Charles River, because there was two bands that made up the entirety of the Massachusetts. There was a northern band and there was a southern band, separated by what's the Charles River today. And his name gets lost in history because Massasoit created an alliance with the Pilgrims. But the Pilgrims, when they landed, couldn't rely on their alliance with Massasoit to save them, to help them, because Massasoit was so far away from them. So they traded with the Massachusetts. And so this is 1620 to 1623. There was no alliance. Chickatabat, who was our main Sachem, didn't favor the English at all. But he was bound because in the north they were creating alliances with the English. So he was bound by that kind of protocol. So in 1623, the Pilgrims' military leader, which I'm sure everyone knows his name, Miles Standish. He has a state park named after him today. Went north on an expedition that was led by Tisquantum, who many of you know him as Squanto. He was led north to the Massachusetts Bay, that area, the heart of the Massachusetts planting fields. That's where he was led. Miles Standish and the other English. And they were traveling north. They call it an expedition. Standish and his men, they wanted very much to have a bear skin. They wanted it. They wanted a bear skin. The only problem was there were no bears along the coast. The entire coast of Massachusetts, pretty much the entire coastline of Massachusetts, was farmland. All of it, farmland. It was fertile. That was the Massachusetts planting fields. There weren't any trees. It was well-maintained planting fields. There were no large game near the coast. It was well managed. Large game, eat your food. You had to travel further into the interior, which the English called the wilderness. It's hard to imagine today what this landscape looked like 400 years ago, but that's what it was. The coastline was pretty much all planting fields. Vast. John Smith wrote about the Massachusetts. The Massachusetts territory is the paradise of all these parts. Their shore shows vast planting fields. Now, if you can picture what vast planting fields look like never ending, vast. That's what he saw. John Smith never stepped ashore. He only sailed by. And this is what he saw of the coastline, vast planting fields, which he called a paradise. So this place where we live today used to be a paradise. I mean, when I envision that, it's just like, it's awesome. Because today, you know, we might see some woods when we're driving, have some woods around our house. We don't have to drive too far before we see a town, a city, and all these things. Can you imagine a paradise of what that would look like? That's what my traditional territory used to be, a paradise. And so back to Miles Standish, traveling north from Plymouth, what's Plymouth today, with his scouts to Squantum, wanting a bearskin. So he went up to around Massachusetts Bay, looking for bearskin. There were no bears, but Miles Standish did find a bearskin. The only problem is this bearskin was on top of Chickatawbut's mother's grave. If you remember, Chickatawbut is the lead Sockham, very powerful. So Miles Standish took the bearskin off of Chickatawbut's mother's grave. Now, every year, Chickatawbut would place a new bearskin on his mother's grave. Kind of like the way, you know, if we have a parent that passes away, every year we bring flowers there, sometimes multiple times a year to honor. Now imagine somebody taking that. You go in there and be like, who took my flowers off my mother's grave? And this is what Chickatawbut saw. So Chickatawbut decided that the Pilgrims have to go. They desecrated his mother's grave. They have to go. They're not welcome here anymore, which anyone would do if someone desecrated your mother's grave. And so Plymouth caught word that the Massachusetts wanted Plymouth gone. Not only the Massachusetts, but also the Nauset, who were on the Cape, wanted the Pilgrims gone because of the things that they were doing. They were stealing food. They weren't building relationships. They had an alliance with Massasoit, but Massasoit was not from here. Massasoit's home was in Narragansett Bay. It wasn't here. He traveled to come here. And so the tribes that were here wanted the Pilgrims gone. And that's not the story you learn about, but that's the reality of what happened. And so the Pilgrims asked for a meeting with the Massachusetts, try to ease tensions with the Massachusetts. Chickatawbut agreed. He was bound to agree. Even when your enemy wants to talk, you talk. If you can avoid war, you avoid war. He was a very strong, good leader. So Chickatawbut sent his Sagamore, my counterpart. His name was Widawamut, to meet with Miles Standish, who the Pilgrims sent to meet. So they met in Wessagusset. Wessagusset is today Weymouth. And that was the site of an English fishing village, fishing town, fishing camp. So they met in a house, an English style house, old English style house that was built for the fishermen who come ashore. So they met to try to ease tensions. Miles Standish had no desire to do that. He cut the heads off of Widawamut and his subordinates that he brought with him. Cut the heads off them. That's not it. Then he brought the heads back to Plymouth. Can you imagine? Can you imagine cutting the head off of somebody and bringing it with you? We don't learn this story about the Pilgrims, but this is what happened. said that the Pilgrims were so horrified by this action that they exiled Miles Standish. I'm not sure I believe that, because the Pilgrims took the heads of Wittawamit and the warriors he brought with him. They hung them on stakes on the outskirts of Plymouth as a warning to the Massachusetts not to resist. That's like mind-blowing. The Pilgrims who, this country shows so much honor, were committing acts of terrorism against the Massachusetts. And that was only 3 years after they landed, 1623. 3 years. Some people believe that there was 50 years of peace because the Pilgrims and Massasoit had an alliance. There wasn't 50 years of peace. There were no years of peace. We call the Pilgrims terrorists because they terrorized us. And that action ruined trade between Plymouth and the Massachusetts. Ruined trade. The Massachusetts wouldn't trade with Plymouth anymore. They wouldn't do it. So on top of the Massachusetts at war with the Abenaki to the north, now you had the Pilgrims to the south killing our leaders. Oh, and just then you had the Mohawks attacking from the west because they wished to trade with the English, but they had to come through Massachusetts to do that. So they started attacking our villages. So at this time in history, the Massachusetts who survived the plagues in a war with the Abenaki, Pilgrims cutting our heads off, and now we have the Mohawk attacking us. It's like it was all-out war in the Massachusetts. And, I came to a realization when I thought about everything that was happening to the Massachusetts. Everybody wanted the Massachusetts territory. Everybody. Only after the plagues, though. After our numbers were depleted, then we get attacked by everybody. That's how it was. So maybe John Smith's words were accurate. Maybe Massachusetts territory was the paradise of all these parts, if everybody wanted it. And so now, at this time, the Massachusetts, who don't get along with Plymouth because of what they did, a few years later, now the Puritans land in the Boston area. And the Pilgrims create an alliance with the northern Massachusetts leader, whose name is Squaw Sockham. It's the only name she ever gave the English. She never gave them her real name. She never wanted them to have that power to know her real name. So she only would go by Squaw Sockham. And she created an alliance with the Puritans because her people were being attacked by the Abenaki. So the Puritans helped her fight off the Abenaki. So it was that alliance with the Puritans that cemented the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which became the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. See, a lot of people think that it was the Pilgrims that became the Commonwealth. It was not. The Pilgrims was a small religious group. The Puritans, they were built on profit. They wanted profit, money. And so what was the Massachusetts Bay Company became the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which became the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So year after year, thousands and thousands of English were filtering to Boston, not Plymouth, to Boston, the center of Massachusetts territory. The Massachusetts getting pushed back further and further, cut off from the coast. You see, in the summertime, we were on the coast because that's where the food source was. That's where our planting fields were. In the winter months, we retreated inland to our hunting fields, to our hunting grounds. So now we're cut off from the ocean. Very important food source because there's too many English coming in. Too many. So we began to be isolated. And the Reverend John Eliot at that time seen that the only way that the Massachusetts can survive living with the English was if they were Christians. Because the English viewed us as savages, devil worshippers. That's how they saw us, not as human beings, because we were not Christian. They viewed us as savages, devil worshippers. And they would kill us for it. So John Eliot created these praying towns where the Massachusetts can be converted to Christianity. So the English couldn't kill us anymore for not being Christian. But they could still take everything from us. So now we're pretty much isolated to these praying towns, which they called plantations. Our men periodically taken out of the villages, out of these towns, praying towns, and thrown in concentration camps on the harbor islands, and then released back to their praying town. All the time, our territory is being gobbled up by the Puritans. This whole time, just gobbled up more and more and more and more and more. You got to remember, every year, thousands upon thousands of English people were coming to this country, to our territory, to straight in the heart of our territory. Warriors shot because they were hunting. Women and children killed just because they were savages. Now, if you could just imagine this time period, just imagine this happening today to your family, to you. How afraid would you be? I mean, it only takes one generation to destroy a culture. We had to cut our hair, couldn't wear hair, couldn't have long hair. We couldn't wear our clothes. We couldn't speak our language. Couldn't sing our songs. It's like they took everything from us. Everything. Everything from us. I mean, I say, the English took everything from us. The colonists took everything from us. They even took our name, which is true, it's accurate. We couldn't even have our name. They took that too. And the reason being that the Commonwealth is called Massachusetts is because that's where the colonists landed. They took the name of the people that were there, and we were here. So when people ask me what happened to the Massachusetts, my first response is, are you serious? What happened to us? We were killed. I mean, that's just in a nutshell. We were killed. We were killed by the colonists. Gobbled up. Survivors isolated on these praying towns, forced assimilation, because it was forced down our throats to assimilate to the English culture, just so we could survive. I mean, honestly, that's how this country was built. That's how this country was founded. I always tell people they built this country on the graves of my ancestors, which they did. It was not a pretty time. It was not a good time. It was not a happy time. Not for us. Maybe for the colonists, because they could do whatever they wanted. There was nothing that was stopping them. And they did whatever they wanted from sea to shining sea. And that's the history of this country. It's not hatred that I'm talking about. There's no revenge in me. I'm just saying the history of what happened to the Massachusetts. Not exclusively, because it happened to all the indigenous people here. But that's the history of this country. And there was so many sayings about us: kill the Indian, save the man. What kind of thing is that? By the sword we seek peace. How by the sword can anyone hope to accomplish peace? It's insanity. And we have sayings too, like with so many bad things happening in this country, you think the whole country is built on indigenous burial grounds, which it is. Our burial grounds are constantly dug up because somebody wants to put them all a house. Our graves disturbed. Does anyone disturb your graves? If they do, they go to prison. Our burial grounds are mostly destroyed for homes, developments, buildings, because they don't care. Oh, that's just the Indian burial ground. This is not something, this colonialism is what it is. And this hatred towards the indigenous people, this racist way of thinking towards indigenous people is not something that happened 400 years ago only. It has continually happened for the last 400 years and is still happening today. It's always happening. Every day of our lives, we have to experience it. Every day that I look at Massachusetts state seal, I get to see Miles Standish's sword above one of our warriors' heads. I say that that's Wittawamit, because that's the only heads that Miles Standish cut off, was Massachusetts warrior heads. And it's on the seal. For us, this is not the home of the free, because we're not free. How can we be free if our freedom was taken away? How can we be free? We're not free. Our freedom was stripped from us. And we can't go back 400 years and change things. We can change things today. So when we see mascots, us as a mascot, I went to a high school that had an indigenous mascot. I had to listen to white people act like they're Indians, dress like they're Indians. Dress like they're me, but I can't be me. See, we couldn't be Indian, killed for being Indian. We were killed for being Indian. But now, the colonizers can be the Indian. They can dress up like us on Halloween. Maybe some pep rallies too. They can say they're going to scalp people and all this. They can do all these things. And it's perfectly acceptable. We're not mascots. We're living people who were traumatized by the founding fathers, murdered by the formation of this country, for the formation of this country. We're not mascots. That's like a trophy. We conquered him. I'll tell you what, I had a friend, good friend of mine, who said something that some indigenous people take offense to, but I did not, because he was right. And he knows what I do. He knows that, I do talks for mascots, just for indigenous people, for our rights to be treated as human beings, honestly, and to educate people about the Massachusetts tribe. And he asked me, what part of being conquered do you not understand? And he didn't have any ill will towards me. He was making a point. That's part of being conquered. We were conquered. That's not a nice thing. It's not a good thing. Eastern Europe right now, it's one people trying to conquer another people. It's a real ugly thing. None of that's taught about this country in our schools. None of it. The only thing they teach is just some fantasy about Thanksgiving. They don't teach the history of this country, the atrocities that were committed, the people that were killed. They don't want people to know. But we have to accept it. Everyone has to accept it. It happened. We can't go back and change it. We can learn from it, though. Everyone's here today. No matter where your ancestors are from today, everybody is here in this place. It'd be better for all of us if we work together. And so right now, as I'm talking to you, there are tribes in Dartmouth meeting with their school committee right now about their mascot. Because the residents of Dartmouth don't want to let go of their Indian name. And if I wasn't here, I'd be there, talking to their school committee, trying to convince their school committee that we're not a mascot. Can you imagine that in the year 2022, we have to try to convince somebody that we're not mascots? There's no other race that has to do that. Just us. There is no other race. There's no other race that has to do that. There's no other race that's used as a mascot. Just look at some of the mascots that are around. I mean, how many of the mascots are real living people today? Mascots are dragons, Trojans, stuff like that. Eagles. We're animals? Mythic creatures? Is that what we are? We're none of those things. We are people that survived a genocide. That's what we are. Survived a genocide on us because of who we were and who we are. We're not a mascot. And, there is a lot of good people who get it and they understand. regardless of, what they are. They understand, they get it. It's so simple. They get it. There's a good number of people that don't get it, and they don't want to get it, and they don't care. We've been trying to push our lawmakers to make it illegal for a school to have an indigenous mascot. It's like pulling teeth. It's like, come on. It's so easy. It's so simple. It's racism to have us as a mascot. All the things, when you have an indigenous mascot, all the negativities that's associated with that mascot goes with it. Even if it's not the school that's producing these negative things. The school might not be doing anything bad with their mascot, but their rival school might be, most likely is. We're going to scalp the Indians this week. We're going to kill all those Indians. I know because I lived through it. And it's hard to convince people to get rid of something that they're attached to. It's mostly older people that went to the school years ago. Oh, you can't change that. That's going to erase everything about my past. That's not accurate. You'll still have all your memories. You'll just have a new mascot today. And so we run into resistance. We run into hate because we want to be treated equally. So there's something very wrong with this country to where we're treated this way. And for us, it didn't happen 400 years ago. It started 400 years ago. It still happens every day. Things are thrown out there at me all the time and day. Oh, come over here. We're going to have a powwow about something. It's everywhere. People just throw things out there. Right now, we have the Department of the Interior trying to erase the word squaw, strike it from all the parks. Strike it. That's one of our words. What happened with that word is the colonists took our word, one of our words for woman, and brought it out west. Brought it west with them. Started calling the indigenous women there squaws. The only problem is they didn't speak our language. They had their own language. And they didn't know what the word meant. So for them, squaw had a negative meaning because they had no idea what it meant. So now one of our words is being treated as if it's a slur. That's our language. Being treated like it's not good enough to be spoken. So it still seems like the Massachusetts, they're still trying to erase us. After 400 years, they're still trying to erase us. And there's some people that think, well, if you get rid of an Indian mascot, you'll be erasing the people. Some people say that, it's part of the whole education of Indians is to have, mascots and, now we can teach them about it. No, none of that has worked. People still don't know. If we're going to have people mocking who we are, then please do forget about us. We don't want these negative stereotypes attached to us any longer. We've been through that before for a long time. We finally are able to speak our own language, to believe what we want to spiritually. There was a long time we couldn't do that. We weren't allowed to do that. We weren't allowed to be Indian. we weren't allowed to be indigenous. You know, I always say that mascots are the colonist trophy. We conquered the Indian. You don't believe me? We got trophies over here. They're our mascot now. Look at them. There's something very wrong with a system that allows this, that refuses to change it. And we've asked our lawmakers to make this change so that they don't put the burden on the indigenous population to go to school with an indigenous mascot and try to convince them and run into that hatred from that community because we're trying to take something away from them. It's really unfair. We're treated totally unfairly. We're not treated like we're human beings still. And it's acceptable. The mascot matters because it's part of that control over us. Just like the sword on the seal. It's part of that control. It's part of who this country is. And people don't like to talk about it because it's not very nice, but it's true. It's part of that control. On a good note, the Commonwealth has decided to redesign the seal. That only took 30 years. And all the tribes in the Commonwealth put tremendous pressure on the lawmakers to do something. And they did. But some of the lawmakers feel, we're changing the seal. Geez, what else do you want? You know, it's just that whole, we want to be treated equally. We don't want to face this racism every day. We don't want our children to face this racism. We don't want your children to face this racism. It's hard for some to see that we don't want to create problems. We just want to be treated equally. You know, we need to heal as a community. We have what we call generational trauma, and it's passed down through the generations, not on purpose, not even knowing we're doing it. But the traumas of our ancestors have been passed down. Because that's the way we communicate. We pass things down. It's part of who we are. And we've passed this generational trauma down without even realizing it to our children. And they pass it down to their children. And we need to heal. We can't heal if we're constantly being cut again. And sometimes you see it in the clippings, Indians win, this, and you know, it's too much. I have children that I pulled off their Little League teams because they were the Indians. Pulled them right off. They got drafted by the Indians. And, you know, I had to meet with them, their organization, Little League, and tell them, my kid's not playing for that team. And they try to convince me, no, they drafted them, they have to play well, not playing for that team. And this is what we have to go through. I mean, some good things have happened. Like I said, they're going to redesign the state seal. The Washington football team, they're not called the Redskins anymore. And that's awesome. But they were forced to change it. It was only when their money was being taken away. Their sponsors said, we're not going to give you any more money, that they changed the name. Because indigenous people have been trying to get Washington to change their name for 20 years, 20 plus years. And it was only when the sponsors decided, we're not going to sponsor anymore. No more money for you. Then they changed the name. So what we're seeing is that more times than not, it's a forced change. You do have communities that have decided that it's not right to have an indigenous mascot. It's racist. And they've changed it on their own. Then you have communities that say, we're not changing it. Don't care what you say. That's our mascot. We're not changing it. And then you have communities that go right down the middle. We'll get rid of the imagery, but we're going to keep the name. Braintree Wumps is one of those. I met with their mayor. Seems like a very nice man. But their town doesn't want the mascot to go away. They actually have a school committee member that got elected because he said, we're going to bring back the Wumps. And what's scary is people voted for him. The school committee member said about me that it must pay well to be the victim. It must pay well to be the victim. Well, how much is 400 years of being the victim worth? How much is that? Some people don't want to let it go no matter what. To some people, we're always going to be the savage. But some people stand up with us. Some people, they stand up and they speak. They say, no, it's not right. We do not have to accept this. And believe me, I appreciate it. We appreciate it so much. We know I'm on a mascot steering committee for the Commonwealth. And all the tribes are represented, but there's a bunch of white people on it too. And they do a lot of work. They do a lot of lobbying. They do a lot of the work. And that's priceless to have somebody standing up with you. Because it's going to take all of us to make this kind of a change. So it's almost 7:30. So I know that it's only supposed to go to 7:45. But I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything. But you can ask away.
Thank you so much. I feel like I wrote down so many things that you said. I have some questions, but I would love to encourage anyone to write in the chat because I don't think anyone can unmute themselves. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat, and then our friend Ria and I are going to read them to fairies if anyone has questions. But I'll give everyone a chance to. But I do have one question if no one else has one. Or maybe I'll ask my question. People are typing in the chat. So what, because you mentioned Dartmouth's mascot, what is their mascot? And because I met someone from Dartmouth that was basically saying, you know, the things that you had referenced were, you know, you're going to erase our memories. And I love what you said, that you still have your memories, you just have a new mascot. Do you have any kind of prediction on how that might go, that meeting? And what is their mascot?
Their mascot is the Dartmouth Indians. And they have a indigenous head, a warrior's head, as their mascot. And you know, it's another thing about mascots. You know, it's like some of them have the Western style bonnets, war bonnets or headdress. which we didn't wear here. We're always classified as, you know, the Raiders, the Savages, not the Savages, maybe not the Savages, but the Warriors. It's like, it's just classifying us like we're the Klingons, which is just some warrior type society. You know, there's nothing saying, you know, the farmers, the fishermen, you know, the growers, you know, the land managers. You know, it's always some hostile thing, and that's how we're perceived. But in Dartmouth, it really doesn't even matter what the school committee decides, because they've already decided that they're going to bring it to a public vote. So it's like jumping through hoops, and once it shouldn't go to a vote in the population. They should just change it because it's not right. When they have the indigenous people saying, when you have an overwhelmingly amount of indigenous people saying something is not right, then they should make that change, especially when you're talking about us. But they're going to end up putting that to a vote for their residents there in Dartmouth. So then, once again, we're at the hands of the colonists to decide what our fate is going to be. And it's insanity on the discrimination and the hate and the racism that we face in 2022. You can't make this stuff up. It's just still happening.
Yeah, and you had mentioned about Massachusetts, the state flag is changing. One of the students asked, what is the process to change a mascot or the name? And I guess that kind of gets into that a little bit, but who has to propose it to change, or is there some sort of like process that has to happen for that to even like start to be a conversation?
With the state seal, they formed a state seal commission to where all the tribes in the Commonwealth has a tribal member on this commission. And basically the entire commission, which is the tribes in the Commonwealth and some other leaders from the communities, and they all basically meet, and they have to redesign the state seal. And I think they have a year to do so, to redesign it, come up with a new design, and the governor is going to end up having to approve the new design, from what I understand it. But it's a very long process. What mascot changes, I believe it's the school committee that can just decide. It's the school committee. We're talking about school. We're not talking about, you know, the entire town, because some people don't even have kids in school. We're talking about the school, which is supposed to be a safe place. The school committee decides. If the school committee decides to change the mascot's changed. And I'm going to tell you what happens. What happens is that Braintree school committee member that ran, his whole campaign was based on bring the Womps back. What happens is that if the community doesn't like the fact that this school committee is changing the mascot, they'll just vote him out. They'll vote him out, and it's happening. And a lot of school committee members are afraid to make that change because they know they could be voted out for making the change. And that's why we need our leaders to make the change.
Sorry. So, I live in Quincy, and so I'm right next to Braintree, and I've seen the hats of people that are in support of bringing that name back, which actually I'm not from the area, so I didn't know really what that meant. But now I do, and it's interesting how like passionate people are about that, bringing that back. But one of the questions in the question and answer, so No Place for Hate, the club that's sponsoring this is from Whitman-Hanson, and we have a school in the district that one of our attendees is wondering what you think. So we have an elementary school that is named Indian Head High School. And so they were just kind of wondering what you think about that name, and maybe what you would say to maybe encourage school committee members to change it, because I remember coming into the district, that was alarming to me. That is the name of one of our elementary schools.
Well, considering that some of our heads were cut off and hung on stakes. I mean, that's when I hear Indian head, I think of what happened to the Massachusetts and what happened to some of our leaders. Our heads were cut off. Really, I mean, our heads were cut off, and I'm not sure of how Indian head got its name. I know Indian Head is one of those names. There's an Indian Head River, and it's just, but I'm telling you, the colonists cut our heads off. Miles Standish probably threw them in sacks or carried them by the hair back to Plymouth. And so for us, when we hear the name spoken by colonists as Indian Head in a school called Indian Head, it's alarming. It's like, really?
And I think it's so interesting you brought up how that hit, like, I grew up in Massachusetts and that was never anything that was brought to my attention. And this has been very enlightening. And again, I thank you so much for taking the time. I know you said that you could have been, at the Dartmouth school committee meeting. And we thank you so much, because I think it is such an important thing to talk about, especially that it is something that's in the community. Another question that was asked was, what have you found to be the best analogy to help people understand why this matters and what helps them identify with it? Because unfortunately, I feel like you have to make it apply to someone's life for them to really get it. And I think you did such a good job with telling the history of everything, but unfortunately, it's not a history that is told in school. So have you found that there's a way for people to really understand, maybe like the hesitant people or the people that are really on the side of, tradition and memories and not wanting to change their history when it's, taking advantage of your history?
It's kind of difficult sometimes, because some people, I mean, they don't care. And if somebody doesn't care, then it's, how are you going to change their mind? We try to establish relationships with communities. So it's not just like, we go and we talk to them about our history and then walk away and we expect them to make all these changes to their community. We really try to establish a relationship with the community, so that the community can not only meet us, but get to know us. And a lot of times it's this building this relationship that they get to see a different perspective that they couldn't see before. And they see it, and it's like an epiphany. They say, oh, I get it now. I understand now. That's so wrong. But sometimes it takes a while. And it's like, it just depends, sometimes when I don't prepare anything when I talk. I just talk from my heart. I mean, that's how I learned how to speak to people. And sometimes when I'm talking about what happened to the indigenous people here, and it's important that when you're talking about the mascot and why we want it changed, because some people don't know why we want it changed. They think we're being honored. So that's why I gave a history of what happened here. Because you have to see the history of this place to understand why it's inappropriate to have us as a mascot. Because a lot of people don't think about that. They don't think about what the indigenous people here went through. And so they have no understanding on why we're not honored that we're a mascot. And so I think that, helping people understand the history of what happened here, we were murdered, we were killed. We were killed. We were stripped of our humanity, stripped of it, and then made a mascot. And so, I mean, at least you're given, when you tell someone the history and explain to them why, and I love that, why the mascot matters, because it's really important, because people just say they want to change our mascot. Jesus, what? you know? And so it's a lot of people have no understanding to the why. So I think it's important to explain the why it's offensive, why we consider that racism, which it is. So I guess I would say, just explain to them the history of the indigenous people here and what they went through and what they continue to go through. And I mean, honestly, there's no other race that has to get viewed as a mascot. I mean, I don't think any other race would accept it. I think they'd be held to pay if a school had some other race as their mascot and then acted like they were that race. I think that there would be lawsuits. They wouldn't even dare do it. But for us, it's a different set of rules.
And that kind of gets to the next point. And a second question was kind of answered in that about convincing lawmakers. It's kind of the same thing as we said with, or as you said with having mascots change in general. But someone asked, how do you deal with the racism and discrimination that you go through in these discussions, right? Because I'm sure you hear pretty ignorant things as you try to explain things to people, as you try to explain how it is not honoring, how it's not, it's ignoring the history. So someone just wanted to know how you deal with that on, I'm not sure if it's a daily basis, but in a pretty frequent basis. They just wanted to know that.
Like if we're doing some kind of talk or some kind of event and we're faced with that, it just proves the point we're trying to make, that, I mean, we're still being treated this way. It's not something that happened 400 years ago. It's something that continually happens every single day. And it's something we have to face all the time. Like I said, it's like this, even though the states say they're going to change it, but growing up, still right now, still everywhere. Courthouses, it's on the municipalities, it's on everywhere. It's everywhere you look. And so it's like we see it all the time. We do see it on a daily basis, whether it's visual or it's vocal. We see it every single day. And how we deal with it, I don't know. Thank you guys for being here. You're helping me deal with it today. You really are. Just having me here is helping me deal with it, because I get to talk about it and I get to explain what's going on here. And that helps. That really does help, that people are listening now. There was a long time, a lot of time, many, many years, decades, centuries, when no one listened. They didn't care. But people are listening now. People are listening now. And the kids growing up today, man, they're awesome. They get it. They understand. They can see it for what it really is. And I'm telling you, our problem is not with kids, with the youth. Our problem is with the adults. They're the ones that don't get it. The youth gets it. They see it. It's the adults that don't get it. So don't be adults. Don't grow up. but no, I'm just kidding. But I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think that was very powerful. I guess because we're trying to end at 7:45, there's just a lot of questions about how to get people to change the mascots. And the last one, I guess I'll say, when it's not a school mascot, how would you go about changing a town mascot? Because this person said, Hanson town mascot is the Warriors, but the school mascot is not. So if a town mascot is a Indigenous mascot, but the school mascot is not, how do you go about it not through the school committee then? Would you have any advice on that?
Well, that would be the town council, if the town has a council. Yeah, I would think the town council, then we need to meet with the town council. Pressure is awesome. When you put pressure on elected officials or leaders, it gets their attention. And so, I mean, that's what's needed both locally and statewide, is we need to put pressure on our leaders to make these changes, because it's long overdue and it's right. Sometimes it's a conversation that we need to have with a council member or however the government of a town or a city. Sometimes it's just a conversation because maybe they're not aware. And sometimes they can make that change or they can put it to a vote. But I would have to say that, if it's the town, then, we need to speak to the leadership of the town to make this change. Because stop calling us warriors, they're making us sound like we're bad people, and it's just ridiculous already. If anything, you want to call us anything, call us patriots, because we're the ones who fought to save our culture. We died trying to save our culture, trying to save the people we were, and we lost. But we're not classified as patriots. We're always classified as the raiders and the warriors, and it's time to change.
Yeah, and like you said, it's always a violent spin on your culture and on your people. And someone commented one of your quotes that mascots are colonized trophies. And they said, "Thank you so much, Fairies, very powerful." We thank you so much. I think, like you said, kids are the ones that get it. And I know my students were so happy that this happened. We appreciate your time so much, and we hope to see change. We hope, now that we have action points going forward with the town mascot and the school mascots, like, we really appreciate it so much. And thank you so much to everyone that joined. Thank you again to South Shore Unity Council. This is such an important talk, and I'm so happy that it happened. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was an honor to talk to everybody. And thank you for listening and taking the time to come to this talk. I appreciate it. Thank you.